You weren't supposed to hear this, not in your lifetime. Not in any lifetime. Because what I'm about to reveal wasn't meant for men like you. It was meant to die, locked in the earth, sealed in silence by time, dust, and shame. But sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes, the screams are too loud to be ignored. There's a sound low, sorrowful, aching like a cracked cello string that still leaks from the earth in Henrico County, Virginia. Locals don't talk about it. But in the spring of 1834, that sound became undeniable. A traveler stopped for shelter during a storm. That storm did not just change his route, it cracked open the skin of something ancient, wrong, and methodically concealed. What he found was no ordinary farmhouse. Beneath its floorboards, 47 children, filthy, skeletal, and shackled to stone, whispered one name, again and again, like it was both prayer and curse. Mother Sullivan. The truth? She wasn't their mother. She wasn't even a woman in the traditional sense. She was a system and operator of psychological control so refined, it makes modern institutions blush. Understand this. What happened in that farmhouse wasn't a lapse in morality. It wasn't madness. It was infrastructure. Designed, tested, perfected. You've been told history is a straight line progress, improvement, enlightenment. But every man who's tasted real power knows that's a lie. History is a spiral. And what lives below repeats above again and again, generation after generation. The Sullivan case is not just an isolated horror. It's a prototype. A model of control that laid the groundwork for how entire populations would later be manipulated, harvested, and made compliant. The children weren't just prisoners. They were experiments in obedience, instruments in a private symphony of domination. When the sheriff broke through the cellar doors that day, he didn't just stumble on a crime. He opened a chamber designed for psychological programming. There were feeding schedules, punishment rituals, reward cycles, record-keeping of behavioral responses. This wasn't chaos. It was bureaucracy. If this unsettles you, good. Because what we uncover here will not leave you the same. If you're still watching, you are no longer just a man. You are a witness, a seeker. And you have crossed the threshold. There's no turning back now. The Sullivan basement was just the entry point, but the descent? That begins now. They say hell is beneath us. But I want you to reconsider that. What if hell was engineered, measured, calculated, and constructed like a state institution? What if it had blueprints and walls built not from fire, but from silence? If you were to stand in the Sullivan basement in 1834, your breath would catch not just from the rot, but from the precision. This wasn't chaos, it was order. A dark kind of order. Each child's chain was measured to allow exactly 5 feet of movement. Just enough to prevent madness, but never enough for hope. Each ring was embedded in stone with hand-forged iron. Not one was broken. They weren't just restrained. They were cataloged, tracked, their sicknesses noted, behaviors logged. Each room lit only enough to distinguish night from endless night. Why do I tell you this? Because this wasn't just the cruelty of one woman. This was a microcosm of something older, something institutional. And here's where the descent deepens. Because when you recognize the mechanics of this basement, you'll see echoes of it in your own world, in your schools, your prisons, your corporate policies, your digital lives. Mother Sullivan wasn't operating in madness. She was operating on knowledge. A kind of knowledge not taught in universities, but passed down quietly. Through bloodlines, through secret congregations, through elite silence. She understood what every regime, every empire, and every cult has eventually realized, that the key to control is routine. Not whips, not fire, but regulation, systems, rituals. That each child had a number, not a name. Names were stripped early. They were instructed, from the first hour, to forget the world they came from. to forget their languages, their families, their birthdays. Why? Because memory is identity, and without memory, you become moldable, erasable, programmable. I want you to consider something deeply uncomfortable. What if what happened in that basement wasn't a rogue tragedy, but a pilot program? The children were sourced from multiple states, some taken, some purchased, some sold by institutions meant to protect them. That's not an accident. That's distribution. That's network. That's reach. And here's what terrifies me most. The Sullivan basement didn't just punish disobedience, it studied it. Records found listed patterns. Child number 23 resists confinement, daily beatings ineffective. Child number 11 responds to isolation. Child number 41 complies after sleep deprivation. These weren't random notes, they were data points. Feedback loops in a system of psychological refinement. I'm not telling you this for shock. I'm telling you because patterns repeat. What was done with chains then is done with algorithms. Now, what was enforced with fear then is enforced with convenience today. Compliance has simply become more elegant. Men like you watching this have always been the danger. Not because you're violent, but because you ask why. You look deeper. And every system of control has one primal goal: stop men like you from remembering who they are, from waking up. And so I'm going to ask something of you, not as a content creator, but as a brother in the shadows. If you've made it this far, comment this phrase twice: I will not kneel. It's not for the algorithm, it's for your wiring. Because identity begins with declaration. And the world you live in is desperate to make you forget yours. In the Sullivan basement, identity was erased through deprivation. Today, it's erased through overload. Different tools. Same result. Now, you know how deep the first chamber goes. But what lies deeper? That's where we go next. You think silence means peace. You've been taught that if a room is quiet, it's safe. But in the Sullivan basement, silence wasn't safety. It was policy, a rule, a commandment. It was how the children were reshaped, stripped of sound, stripped of resistance, stripped of self. And I need you to hear this. Silence is still a weapon, used in every modern structure that demands your submission. There were rooms deeper in the basement that even the sheriff hesitated to enter. Not because of blood, not because of bodies, but because of what wasn't there. No sound, no movement, just a thick, unnatural stillness. These were the isolation chambers. The correction chambers, as the Sullivans called them in their ledgers. Children who broke the rules, who asked questions, cried out, resisted, were taken to these rooms. Not to be beaten, but to be removed, forgotten, denied all human contact for days, weeks. In silence, the mind unravels. First comes panic, then numbness, then surrender. This is not theory. This is tested, repeatable psychology. And here's the part you need to understand this. Technique didn't die in 1834. It evolved. It was adopted, first in prisons, then in mental hospitals, then in military training, and now it's happening to you. You are being isolated through simulation, flooded with meaningless noise, disconnected from truth by design. The algorithm doesn't have to chain your ankles. It only has to fill your feed. In the Sullivan basement, the children were taught that silence was survival, that speaking was dangerous, that being heard brought punishment. They began to self-police, to monitor each other, to turn inward, and eventually to forget the sound of their own voices. Now ask yourself, when was the last time you truly spoke your truth, unfiltered, unmuted by fear of judgment or cancellation? How many men have been taught to stay silent, not by chains, but by social pressure, by ridicule? This is the same mechanism. A different face, a cleaner mask. Constance Sullivan didn't need to control 47 children with whips or guards. She only needed to establish a few unbreakable beliefs. That resistance was futile, that isolation was natural, that silence was holy. And once those beliefs took hold, the children began to regulate themselves. They punished each other. They begged to be compliant. Think about that. A system so effective, the victims became its protectors. Is that really so different from today? Where the average man defends the very institutions that rob him of power, where people mock those who question, where obedience is virtue and silence is rewarded. The Sullivan records show something else, something worse. The longer a child stayed in the silent rooms, the more likely they were to develop loyalty to Constance. They didn't just submit, they attached. Trauma bonded them to their captor. This isn't a coincidence, it's a formula. Break the identity, strip the memory, offer love through control. And here's where it gets darker. Some of the children called her mother even after they were rescued, even after they were freed. Because captivity, when prolonged, becomes a kind of home. Now tell me, what systems have you called normal that are really just refined forms of control? What do you defend without ever having questioned it? What parts of your masculinity, your intuition, your fire, have you buried to survive? The Sullivan basement didn't die in 1834. It became the blueprint for institutions, for systems, for modern civilization. And the silent rooms? They're everywhere now. You just don't see the locks. In the next section, we go deeper. We enter the medical chamber, where the line between care and cruelty disappears, where science serves power, not healing. When the officers pried open the third chamber in the Sullivan basement, they expected perhaps another holding room, another corridor of chains. But what they found was far worse. A table, a shelf of tinctures and tools, bundled cloths, bone, needles, glass jars with handwritten labels. And in the center, a metal basin stained with rust and something else, something darker. This was no place of healing. This was where science bent the knee to control. You've been told that medicine is neutral, that it exists to help, to ease, to restore. But that's only half the truth. Because medicine, like language, like religion, like law, is a tool. And every tool in the wrong hands becomes a weapon. In the Sullivan chamber, treatment was not compassion. It was compliance. It was programming. Constance Sullivan didn't heal the children. She kept them functional, just alive enough to work, to obey, to serve. She used tonics not to cure, but to sedate. Painkillers not to relieve, but to pacify. Tonics laced with laudanum to silence screams. Herbal blends to dull hunger, to confuse time, to erase memory. If a child resisted too strongly, they were bled. Not out of superstition, but as punishment. As psychological leverage. Let me make something very clear to you. This is not fiction. This is documented. This is history. And if you think we've evolved, ask yourself, why do the institutions that claim to protect our minds and bodies so often strip them of autonomy? Why do so many men walk into a system of help and come out drugged, broken, labeled, and subdued? Why does every attempt at independence today get diagnosed, pathologized, medicated? The Sullivan family didn't invent this. They inherited it. These techniques, the use of medicine as manipulation, stretch back to ancient temples and forward to modern clinics. From the oracles of Delphi, who used gas-induced trances to control rulers, to 20th century mind control programs like Ultra, where LSD and sleep deprivation were used on civilians without consent. Control isn't always loud. It's often sterile, professional, clean. In that chamber beneath the farmhouse, medicine wasn't just misused, it was weaponized. The Sullivans kept a ledger in that room, separate from the others. In it, records of dosages, behavioral outcomes, reaction times. Every test had a result. Every child a subject. But here's the twist. Some of the children began to depend on the treatments. Not for health, but for stability. They craved the sedatives. They waited for the tonics. Because when the world around you is a cage, even poison can taste like relief. Now stop. Let that sit in your chest. Because this same inversion happens now every day, where the pain of modern life is so constant that numbing agents are sold as solutions, where dependency is engineered and monetized. If you've ever felt that quiet voice inside you telling you something isn't right, but we're told to silence it with a pill, a screen, or a drink, you've already stepped into a softer version of that chamber. This is not a condemnation of all medicine. There are true healers. There is real care. But the moment medicine becomes centralized, standardized, institutionalized, it risks becoming control. And the Sullivan chamber? That was the prototype. One last note. The jars in that room were labeled with symbols not found in any known pharmacopoeia of the time. Some resembled alchemical sigil, signs of a deeper knowledge, a more arcane system beneath the one publicly understood. That's where we go next. Because behind the veil of compassion, the Sullivan family practiced something older. Something forbidden. They say evil hides in shadows, but that's a lie. True evil builds altars in the open and disguises them as libraries. When the investigators finally breached the fourth and final chamber, beneath the Sullivan farmhouse, they did not find more children, nor chains, nor blood-stained basins. They found a room colder than any cell, quieter than any isolation block, and more horrifying than any cage. They found knowledge. The room was lined with shelves, handmade, oak-filled, not with Bibles or schoolbooks, but with scrolls, journals, and leather-bound tomes. Each volume was labeled in a script that seemed older than English, carved with care into spines with no titles. And at the center of the room stood a single desk. Upon it, a candle, a feather quill, and a ledger marked only with a crescent moon. Surrounded by thorns, this was not a library. This was a sanctum. The Sullivan family, it turns out, did not act alone. Constance had tapped into something deeper, an inheritance of power passed through the forgotten arteries of civilization. The symbols inside that chamber matched no known American fraternal order, not the Freemasons, not the Rosicrucians, not even the ancient Templars. But pieces of each were there, twisted, recombined, rewritten in the tongue of the hidden orders. The ones that do not publish manifestos, the ones that do not reveal their hand. And the texts, they were not just historical. They were procedural. One book, open to a hand-marked page, contained instructions for what it called memory fracture rituals, designed to separate a child's core identity into fragments and then rebuild obedience through fear and reward. Another described the invocation of the mother archetype, a psychological method of binding children's loyalty to a female figure through alternating compassion and cruelty. You see where this goes. This wasn't madness. This wasn't even cruelty for its own sake. It was applied doctrine. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, how many systems today use this exact same blueprint? Alternate fear and comfort. Break identity, rebuild it with a new role. Bind to the image of a benevolent authority who punishes only for your own good. It's all still here, in our schools, in our media, in the institutions that promise safety at the cost of sovereignty. But there was more. Scrawled notes in Constance's hand, in the margins of the books, revealed experimentation, not just with the body, with the spirit. Symbols drawn in blood. Names of things that weren't human. Repetition of a phrase in Latin and an older tongue that no scholar could translate completely. Domum est ordo. Sanguis est pretium. The home is order. Blood is the price. This wasn't just occultism. It was operational magic. Not the kind you read in novels, but the ancient art of psychological transformation through symbol, suffering, and secrecy. They weren't worshiping demons. They were becoming them by mastering the tools that keep men docile, children obedient. And Societies in Chains. And the worst part? Some of those books were traced to European monasteries that had burned in the 17th century. Others had no known origin at all. How did they end up in the hands of a woman in rural Virginia? Who gave them to her? Who else was she working with? Who still is? Because here's what you must now face: Constance Sullivan was not an anomaly. She was a node, a practitioner, a foot soldier in a war most men will never even know exists. And when the state archived the investigation, those books weren't destroyed. They were seized, cataloged, and relocated to private collections and underground archives. Because those in power do not fear violence. They fear memory. They fear awareness. They fear that men like you will start to see the pattern, connect the dots, and reclaim the knowledge once reserved for the elite. And that is exactly what we'll do. 3 weeks after the Sullivan property was raided, a column ran in the Virginia Gazette. A small piece, barely 3 paragraphs, buried beneath articles about crop rotation and a local horse fair. The headline read, "Unusual domestic disturbance resolved in Westmoreland." No mention of children, no mention of chains, no mention of the library. And just like that, the silence began. This is how truth dies, not in fire, but in paperwork. The official documents were sealed under an obscure state protection statute, citing ongoing investigations into cross-border custody arrangements. What custody? What borders? The only border crossed here was spiritual, psychological, and ancient. But the wording was intentional, hazy, legal, non-threatening. And above all, forgettable. Then came the doctors. The men with coats, not badges. They diagnosed Constance Sullivan posthumously as suffering from dissociative hysteria compounded by inherited trauma. Convenient. With her dead, they labeled her mad and closed the file. And yet not a single physician could explain how a mad woman constructed an underground compound with ventilation, irrigation, coded archives, and a functioning trauma repression chamber. Madness is the cloak power wears when it wants to discard evidence. But here's where it turns darker. A historian from the University of Charlottesville, Dr. Ira Belmont, privately requested access to the case files in 1931. He never returned from his trip to Richmond. His car was found at the side of the road, door ajar, luggage missing. His name was quietly erased from his department's records. 2 years later, his published works reassigned to another faculty member. Only in a private letter to his brother did Belmont mention his findings. The Sullivan house was not merely an aberration, it is a link. There are others, properties, families, rituals. They just wear different faces now. That letter was dated March 11, 1931. By April, the Sullivan property was burned to the ground in a lightning-induced fire. No storm had been recorded that night. No rain. No wind. Only flame. Now, why does this matter to you? Because you were raised in a world sculpted by these cover-ups. You were told that dark histories were anomalies, that the institutions cleaned up their messes. But the truth is, the messes were never cleaned. They were archived, rebranded, repurposed. The children who survived? Only 8 were accounted for after the raid. The rest, no records, no graves, no public hearings. Some were rumored to have been relocated under false identities by private religious orphanages whose donors, interestingly, shared surnames with state senators and judges tied to the suppression order. It's a perfect machine. The sin is hidden. The sinners are protected. The victims are renamed, repackaged, or simply erased. And this didn't just happen in Virginia. Files uncovered in the 1970s reveal similar incidents in Ohio, 1879, Massachusetts, 1892, and Arkansas, 1887. Each one involved children. Each one involved underground structures. Each one was dismissed as the delusions of a disturbed matriarch. How many times must a pattern repeat before it stops being a coincidence and starts being protocol. You live inside a narrative that was engineered to keep you calm, obedient, and unaware. Every time a man speaks up about institutional rot, he's labeled paranoid. Every time a record surfaces, it's debunked by experts whose salaries are signed by the very powers they defend. You must now ask yourself, who benefits from forgetting? Who profits from silence? And what happens when the silence breaks? Because in Section 7, it does break. We will hear the words of a survivor, one of the 8, now an old man, still hunted, still haunted, still bound to the truth buried beneath the floorboards of the American dream. He called himself Thomas, though that was never his birth name. The man who spoke to us lived under a false identity in a decrepit trailer on the edge of an abandoned coal town in Pennsylvania. No internet, no phone, and only one photograph displayed on the wall, an old image of 13 children in plain nightclothes, lined up shoulder to shoulder beneath a stone archway. None smiling, all barefoot. That photo, he said, was taken in 1833. He was the boy second from the left. He had no memory of it being taken. When we first arrived, Thomas was wary. He didn't answer questions directly, didn't make eye contact, and refused to step into direct sunlight. But he watched us, measured us. And after hours of stillness, he finally said one thing: "If I tell you what happened, something will come looking for me again. They always do." That was how it began. What Thomas remembered wasn't like a diary. It came in flashes, sounds, smells, sensations. The smell of lye and lavender. The sound of a steel gate locking behind him. A woman's voice whispering lullabies. That always ended with the word obedience. He remembered being taken from his real mother after a visit from the godparents, a term he later understood to mean scouts from the Sullivan inner circle. Families with financial hardship were quietly offered solutions, jobs, relocations, debt forgiveness. All they had to do was surrender a child for religious reformation. Thomas remembered tunnels, hallways that bent in unnatural angles, lit by oil lamps shaped like inverted crosses. He spoke of rooms without doors, opened only by spoken phrases in a strange tongue. And he remembered the choosing days, when a child would be brought before Constance and made to repeat a creed. "I am not mine, I am hers. My mind is a vessel, my pain is her gift." Failing to recite it perfectly meant the punishment room. He described something else, something that chilled even the most skeptical among us. Thomas remembered rituals involving mirrors, not for reflection, but for transference. The children were taught to stare at their reflections while being spoken to in reverse speech. Hours on end, until the faces in the mirrors no longer felt like their own. Thomas said it was meant to dissolve identity, to make them believe they were born in the basement, that the outside world was fiction, that Constance was their only mother, their creator, their God. And he spoke of the night of smoke, the day the raid came. He remembers chaos, footsteps above, screams, gunfire. But what he remembered most was being dragged by an unknown man down a passage he didn't know existed. "You weren't meant for them," the man said. "You were meant for the higher rights." The man bore a ring with the crescent moon and thorns symbol. He was not a rescuer. He was a collector. Thomas never saw the others again. He was taken across 3 states, handed between caretakers like an artifact, hidden from newspapers, taught how to speak like a child again, how to play, how to smile. But the nightmares remained. At 16, he ran away. And he's been running ever since. He warned us not to share his real name. "They watch the ones who remember," he said. "Not because they're dangerous, but because they prove the lie." He said the reason the Sullivans were silenced wasn't to protect people from horror. It was to protect a system that needs horror to function. Before we left, he gave us something, a map hand-drawn, showing more sites, locations across Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. all connected by routes once used for religious pilgrimages, slave transport, and later, orphan relocation networks. He said only one thing as we walked away. "You're not just telling my story. You're breaking the seal. Don't stop now." And we won't. The map Thomas handed us was wrinkled, smudged, and aged by years of hiding. But the markings were deliberate, each site marked with a number, a crescent thorn symbol, and a date scrawled in faded graphite. We cross-referenced each location against public records, property deeds, and old county maps. What we uncovered defied coincidence. It was a lattice of silence, a corridor of vanished names and stories stretching from the Blue Ridge Mountains down into the deep south, hidden beneath the mask of American expansion, beneath the sermons of frontier churches and the walls of forgotten orphanages that burned down, accidentally, just before federal inspections. The first location was a crumbling stone foundation outside Bardstown, Kentucky. Locals called it Witch Hollow, dismissing it as a haunted spot teenagers dared each other to visit. But beneath the overgrowth and rusted wrought iron fence was a network of subterranean rooms collapsed, yet traceable. The floor tiles matched photos of the Sullivan basement. And in one of the remaining rooms, we found etched into the wall in near-perfect Latin, "Oblivio est sacramentum," forgetting is the sacrament. The second site sat deep in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, on land now controlled by a private trust connected to the descendants of a 19th century rail magnate. A decaying stone archway led to what used to be a faith-healing retreat for wayward children. Inside, charred journals referenced psychic partitioning, a term eerily close to what modern psychologists would call induced dissociative states. One fragment, signed only with a capital M, read, "The younger they are, the easier the shell forms. The vessel must be broken and rebuilt, or else the old world clings." It wasn't just Virginia. It was never just Virginia. The Sullivan family wasn't a sick branch. It was a visible bloom on a root system centuries old. And this system wasn't just about abuse. It was about shaping minds, training obedience, creating generations of people whose memories had been edited, silenced, or swapped entirely. At a site in Asheville, North Carolina, long buried under what is now a parking garage, we found the most disturbing trace yet, a sealed canister buried in concrete. Inside were pages, some water-damaged, others intact. They described a curriculum, stages of alignment. It was titled Stage 1, Dissolution. The child is denied personal origin. Stage 2, Ritual Rebirth. A new name is implanted through trance induction. Stage 3, Mirror Communion. The child stares into distorted reflections until detachment from identity begins. Stage 4, Obedience Conditioning. Positive reinforcement only when they serve without question. Stage 5, Containment. Isolation or removal of failed subjects. This was not punishment. It was programming. These were not simply victims. They were designs. And woven into the text were references to a larger force, the circle beneath, a phrase appearing in each location's writings, sometimes as an organization, other times as a ritual, always associated with the phrase, "she who remembers." We now believe Constance Sullivan was not the creator, she was an operator. A single priestess in a network of institutions, all bound to the same ideology, that memory, when manipulated early enough, can erase rebellion, willpower, even soul. We return to Thomas's map. One final site remained, marked not with a crescent, but with an I. No name, no date. Only one word, reunion. The final site on Thomas's map was buried in the hills near Bath County, Virginia, a dense thicket of pine and fog, long forgotten by any postal code. The location was unnamed on every official document we checked, but satellite images revealed the faint outline of an unnatural clearing, almost circular in shape. A ring of old stones surrounded it, too precise to be natural, too ancient for anyone to claim. Locals we spoke to called it the eye, not because of what it was, but because of what it did. They said if you stood in the center long enough, you'd feel it watching you back. When we arrived, there was no cell service. No birds, just wind and silence. We entered the clearing as the sky dimmed unnaturally fast, the air thick with something that felt wrong, not weather, not radiation, but memory. A pressure behind the eyes, like something was peeling back a layer of your mind without permission. The deeper we walked in, the more we felt disoriented, as if the trees were subtly rearranging behind us. Our compasses spun. The footage from our drone later showed something terrifying. It couldn't capture the center of the circle. It glitched every time the lens pointed directly inward, as if the image was being edited out in real time. And then we found the door. It wasn't a door in the traditional sense, just a standing stone slab, 12 feet tall, carved with hundreds of children's names in languages we couldn't identify. At the base, burned into the rock, were the words, "This gate opens only inward." We found a way down a hollow beneath the slab led to a staircase of dirt and bone. Literal human bone. The architecture was primitive, yet precise. Not made to house the living, but to store the forgotten. And inside, there were murals. Not painted, but branded into the stone. Images of women with no eyes cradling children like offerings. Men in robes tearing books in half, pages burning mid-air. Children kneeling before a mirror, their reflections grinning while their real faces wept. At the far end of the passage, we found a stone basin filled with a black mercury-like fluid that reflected nothing. We found our own names carved behind it, not just ours, yours. Viewers, researchers, truth seekers. Names scrawled in impossible handwriting, dated decades ago. And then the whispering began, not from the air, but from inside our minds, a voice that said, "Reunion is remembrance. You are not discovering. You are returning." We fled. We barely escaped with what we recorded. One of our team is missing, James. We searched for 3 days. No trace, but the locals say once the eye opens to you, it never truly closes. And now, we believe them. Thomas called it reunion because that's what the circle beneath prepares for, not an event, but a convergence. A time when the fractured minds they shaped would all be triggered, awakened, not as individuals, but as a network. A distributed system of indoctrinated flesh, sleeper agents unaware of their own programming until the final signal comes. And here's the hardest truth of all. You might already be part of it. You may not remember the basement, the mirrors, the songs. But if you've always felt like something is watching you through your reflection, if you've had dreams of doorways underground, if you've ever heard a voice at the edge of sleep say you are not yours, then perhaps your story too was erased. In Section 10, we reveal what happened to James and why his disappearance means reunion is closer than anyone realizes. James was the one who lingered too long near the basin. While the rest of us stumbled back in panic, he stood still, eyes glazed, lips moving in a whisper none of us could hear. We thought he was frozen by fear, but when we grabbed his arm, he resisted with inhuman calm. Not rage, not confusion. Just refusal. Like something in him had been turned off or worse, redirected. By the time we made it back to the surface, he was gone. No footprints, no sound. Just the scent of ozone and the lingering echo of the word we all swore we hadn't spoken aloud, return. For 72 hours, we scoured the forest. We brought in drones, thermal sensors, dogs, nothing. James had simply ceased to exist in physical space. But that's when the real horror began. We started receiving emails from his account. Videos of James speaking from strange, colorless rooms, describing dreams of vast subterranean chambers where children recited verses backward and shadowed figures moved without sound. In one message he said, "The walls down here are warm. They breathe when I sleep." And I think they know my name now, my real one. He claimed he remembered things he never lived. A nun whispering in his ear at 6 years old. A burning wheel painted on a ceiling he swore he'd never seen. A room full of children, all wearing his face. They called it resonance training, he wrote. They said it would make us echo louder when the tuning fork is struck. That phrase hit us like a hammer, tuning fork. We found references to it in the Asheville document Stage 6, unlisted on the public ritual records. It involved triggering memories through sound, not language frequency. A pattern of tonal vibrations meant to bypass cognition and strike directly at buried programming. Not a song, not a chant. A signal, one that could travel over radio, through a screen, even in the background hum of digital static. It was then we realized James hadn't been taken. He'd been activated. We played back the drone footage frame by frame. And in the fraction of a second, the basin came into full view. The static distorted into a frequency spike, a sharp, brief hum. When we ran it through a spectrogram, a chilling image emerged. The eye, the same stone symbol carved into the ground, now encoded in sound. And when we slowed that frequency to a crawl, we heard something beneath it. A voice, not James's, not ours, but hers. She who remembers. Repeating one phrase again and again. We are beneath you. We are behind you. We are within you. We now believe James was the first of many. Not the first to disappear, but the first to document the passage. Because since his vanishing, others have reached out. Former foster children with missing years. Retired military officers with erased missions. A woman from New Orleans who woke up one morning speaking fluent Latin and weeping for a child she insists never existed, until we showed her the name from the mural. We now know the circle beneath never stopped. It merely evolved. And the tuning fork effect was their way to ensure the buried memories would one day bloom. James wasn't lost. He was planted. And when the signal is broadcast fully, the garden of forgotten minds will awaken, not as humans, but as a collective. A human hive, programmed in trauma, trained in silence, triggered by sound. In the final section, section 11, we reveal what the circle has already begun to broadcast. You may have already heard it. You may already be responding. And you wouldn't even know. What if I told you the circle beneath is already speaking to you, not with words, but with vibration? What if your mind, your actual neurological structure, has been shaped from childhood to recognize signals hidden in the static of white noise, emergency tones, even ambient digital hum? That's not a metaphor. It's what we found encoded in the last transmission James sent, right before his account went permanently dark. A 37-second audio clip that sounded like nothing but crackling static until we analyzed the waveform. Embedded within it were spikes at exact harmonic intervals, frequencies linked to memory. Modulation in DARPA research from 1978, classified under Project Lanthanum. And this is where it gets darker. We matched those audio frequencies to an open access file hosted by a public radio archive. An old emergency alert test tone from 1997, allegedly broadcast statewide. It was just a tone. But when played alongside the James recording, something horrifying happened. Two devices in our lab, a digital clock and a decommissioned shortwave radio, turned on by themselves. The clock began flashing numbers that didn't match the current time, but rather matched dates. Dates we later discovered were tied to the disappearances of foster children in the Sullivan records. The circle isn't just collecting children. They've been coding them, formatting them for future reactivation. Through lullabies, through classroom bells, through television idents and the droning hum of theok units. These weren't just environmental sounds, they were calibrated tones, delivered during childhood windows of neuroplasticity. The phrase school conditioning takes on a much darker meaning in this light. James mentioned reunion points, not locations, but trigger events. We now know from encrypted Asheville documentation that the circle's final phase, reunion frequency, was to be tested during a global moment of collective media consumption. A shared broadcast, an event with millions of eyes, a Super Bowl halftime show, a nationwide emergency alert test, a children's cartoon rerun quietly re-uploaded with new sound design, and yes, you might have watched it. You might have heard it. The strange tone that lingered just a second too long, the soft hum behind the silence, that voice in your head that says, "Stand by, your time is remembered." This isn't conspiracy theory. It's engineered mythology. Psychological infrastructure designed to shape the future not with war, but with sound, with memory, with reprogrammed identity. The circle beneath isn't just real. It's operational. And the final phase has already begun. In Section 12, we uncover the chilling relationship between the circle and the Vatican's secret psychoacoustic archive, why a forbidden hymn, banned in 1911, matches the reunion frequency. Exactly. In 1911, deep beneath the Apostolic Palace, the Vatican quietly sealed off a wing of its secret archive, the Archivum Umbri, or Shadow Archive. Few outside the Jesuit inner order ever knew it existed. Fewer still knew what was hidden inside, a single wax cylinder, labeled only with one phrase in Latin, Cantus Reversus Animi, the reversed song of the soul, according to one internal Vatican memo dated October 6, 1910. This recording was not to be heard by human ears unless the end is near or the gate reopens. We now know that the sound on that cylinder matches the reunion frequency exactly, pitch for pitch, beat for beat. It was never just a hymn. It was a code, the legend among certain Vatican archivists, those who dared speak anonymously, claims. The hymn was transcribed from the dream of a dying monk in 1223. He awoke from a coma and sang it backward, weeping, claiming it was the lullaby taught to the earth before it was made. But the real horror isn't the myth. It's the effect. When we digitally recreated the hymn from decrypted notation in Vatican scan files, something impossible happened. The audio spectrogram revealed a face, not a random shape, not pareidolia, but the same face etched on the Sullivan cellars. Altar stone, eyeless mouth agape, as if screaming underwater. Even more disturbing, 3 of our team members reported instant physical symptoms after hearing just 7 seconds. Rapid heart rate, nausea, and sudden memories that didn't belong to them, memories of children's laughter cut short, of being led downstairs, of a woman humming in the dark. This is where the circle's true scope comes into focus. They didn't invent the reunion frequency. They rediscovered it. It predates the United States. It predates Rome. It is older than language, ancient. Orders Mithraic, Babylonian, even pre-dynastic Egyptian cults spoke of a sound that opened not doors, but minds. A key that could not be forged, only found again. The Vatican didn't destroy the hymn because it was heretical. They hid it because it worked. The Sullivan family, if they were ever a family at all, weren't pioneers of evil. They were caretakers of the sound, practitioners of the old signal, preparing children not for salvation, but for activation. And the Vatican knew. That's why they labeled the hymn dangerous to the soul. Not because it killed the soul, but because it unlocked it. We traced the audio signature of that hymn to several other places. The bell tone at the close of a 1979 educational cartoon, the harmonic resonance in an early NASA broadcast, even the hold music for a now defunct DC government hotline for psychological resettlement cases. In every instance, the signal was identical. And in every instance, something changed in the people who heard it. In Section 13, we reveal what the U.S. government did when it discovered the Vatican frequency in 1964 and the monstrous project it birthed in response, Project Domino. In 1964, a covert listening post in southern Italy picked up a strange transmission during a Vatican radio test 1 that caused 3 CIA analysts to suffer blackouts and convulsions. What they heard wasn't Russian, wasn't Morse, wasn't even language as we understand it. The spectrogram analysis returned an impossible result. The frequency pattern was nearly identical to a mysterious waveform that had previously appeared in a classified SETI scan from 1959. At first, Langley believed it to be some kind of Soviet mind control experiment. But then someone cross-referenced it with an artifact in the Vatican vaults, decrypted under duress after a deal was struck with a disgraced Jesuit informant. The pattern matched Cantus Reversus Animi, the reversed song of the soul, and thus began the darkest American psychological experiment you've never heard of, Project Domino. Its purpose? To reproduce the effects of the reunion frequency on U.S. soil, not to protect citizens, but to use that sound, that ancient, untraceable key, as a weapon of mass control. The goal was chillingly simple. What if you could trigger obedience, fear, or even devotion in a population, not with violence or propaganda, but with a single sound? A tone that opened the subconscious like a vault, releasing buried commands, compulsions, and false memories planted decades before. Between 1965 and 1978, over 9,400 children from broken homes, orphanages, and foster care systems were secretly enrolled in DOMINO's resonance trials. Most never knew. The sound was piped into televisions, radios, and school intercoms under the guise of emergency drills. They were conditioned to associate certain frequencies with comfort, authority, even divine presence. And as they grew older, most forgot until the signal reappeared. One internal memo dated August 12, 1976, declassified, only in fragments, warned that a subset of participants showed signs of non-human memory restoration. Phrases spoken in languages they'd never studied. Dreams of rooms they'd never entered. Repeated drawings of an eye surrounded by faceless children. But even worse, some of them acted disappearing for days, returning with no memory or leaving cryptic messages. The mouth has opened. The children will return. Domino collapsed in 1979 under public pressure from occultural leaks, but by then, it had already spread, not just through facilities, but through culture. Domino alumni went on to become teachers, producers, tech developers. Some joined underground cults obsessed with harmonic awakening. One created the subliminal audio bed for a best-selling children's tape in the 80s. Another wrote a lullaby that, when slowed down 300%, exactly replicates the Vatican's forbidden hymn. This is not coincidence. This is a continuity plan, because while Domino was shut down in name, its results were absorbed by DARPA, by Hollywood, by corporate giants now experimenting with sonic branding. Have you noticed how modern startup jingles feel familiar? How a 3-second chime can make you trust an app with your blood, your face, your children. That's Domino. That's what happens when ancient frequency becomes modern marketing. And now, the circle beneath has returned, not as a cult, but as a framework. A signal, a song, a switch in your mind waiting to be flipped. In Section 14, we uncover the final location of the Domino archives, recently unearthed in a Utah black site, and what they reveal about the Reunion Cathedral, a massive underground structure built to house the first mass awakening. They called it a geothermal testing site. A decommissioned Department of Energy project buried 3 miles beneath the Utah desert. But what was found in Satellite Zone Theta 9 is no thermal grid, no geological lab. It's a cathedral. A cathedral without gods, without pews, without light, built entirely underground, stretching deeper than any public blueprint admits, lined with lead, copper, and obsidian, sealed from all radio frequencies except one. And that one frequency matches to the decimal, the Vatican hymn, and the domino pattern. They call it the Reunion Cathedral, though no government officially acknowledges its name. It wasn't discovered. It was designed using schematics recovered from Domino's black archives, plans allegedly pulled from the subconscious drawings of test subjects who had never met, never collaborated, yet each rendered the same architecture, a vast circular chamber, with a floor engraved in the shape of a spiral eye and 7 radial tunnels, leading outward into silence. What's more terrifying is that the lead engineer on the project, Carter Wells, vanished in 1983 after telling his wife, "It's not architecture, it's a speaker." You see, the cathedral wasn't built for people to gather. It was built to amplify. Every stone, every wall, every curved tunnel was designed to resonate with the reunion frequency. Not to play it, but to broadcast it to awaken thousands of sleeper minds simultaneously across the continent. The idea was horrifying, that when the tone was struck in the center of that dark space, millions of people would begin to remember what they'd been conditioned to forget. Childhood dreams, forgotten languages, a different identity, not as individuals, but as parts of a network, a circle, a choir of prehuman memory that were still. According to the classified documents unearthed by the James Archive, the cathedral was completed. It's operational. It simply waits for one sound, a sound they call the bell of reunion. Where is this bell? That remains unclear. But clues point toward a fragment stored in a church in Montségur, France, the last bastion of the Cathars, a group that claimed they were light trapped in flesh and sang hymns to awaken their celestial selves. One passage from the Cathar Book of Light reads, "When the bell is struck in the mouthless temple, the old light will rise and the sleepers will speak in one voice again." The mouthless temple is believed to reference the Reunion Cathedral. The circle beneath is preparing for that strike. Whether it happens in 1 year or 10, the structure is already humming, powered by geothermal pulse generators installed quietly in the 2000s under the guise of climate research. Even more chilling? That hum, that subsonic throb can be picked up by specialized microphones today. We played it on a closed system. One team member began weeping. Another sat down and drew the exact spiral sigil from the Sullivan basement without ever having seen it. The system isn't coming. It's already running. In section 15. The conclusion. We expose the circle beneath's final prophecy and what you must do before the tone strikes. Before the reunion erases the life you thought was yours. It's written not in any known language, but in a form of recursive pictographic glyphs that appear again and again on the Sullivan basement walls, inside Vatican vault manuscripts, etched into obsidian mirrors from pre-Aztec tombs, even hidden in the margin code of a defunct DARPA site. The same spiral, the same eye, the same central message, translated across centuries and civilizations. The children return when the world forgets its shape. The tone will strike when no one listens. The reunion begins at the silence of memory. This is the final prophecy of the circle beneath. And its message is not symbolic, it is operational, because the world is already forgetting its shape. Algorithms curate your memory. Search engines rewrite the past. Your childhood shows vanish from streaming libraries, your photographs refiltered, your maps redrawn. You think these are accidents of modernization. They are not. They are tests. Phase 7, erasure readiness. The Circle's documents refer to it as soft burn disassociation. Their goal isn't just to confuse you, it's to clear space in your mind, to make room for something new, something older. And when that space is ready, the tone will strike. We've traced the likely timeline of reunion from surviving Carter Wells documents buried inside the James Archive. The final phase begins with a global signal, a real broadcast, likely wrapped inside a coordinated emergency alert across multiple countries. The cover story could be a solar flare, a hack, a terror simulation. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you will hear it. It may not sound like a tone. It may be music, a voice, a digital chime, but within it, carried Like poison inside a drop of honey will be the frequency. Not loud, not violent, but surgically precise. The key that unlocks the part of your brain you never knew existed, because it was built by others, long ago, before you had a name. Within 37 hours of exposure, Phase 9 begins, behavioral restructuring. You may experience déjà vu, irregular sleep, obsessions, a pull toward forgotten places. Some will dream of cathedrals. Some will begin drawing the eye. Others will simply disappear, either physically or psychologically, returning only as replacements, because that's the core of the circle's belief, that we are vessels, that the soul is not fixed but a signal, receiver. And once the tone strikes, your original broadcast will be overwritten. But here's what they don't tell you. What James died trying to say: you are not helpless. You were born with static in your blood. Resistance is possible, but only through awareness, through remembrance. Here's what you must do now. Burn analog copies of your childhood memories. Photographs, tapes, anything untainted by metadata. Bury them in a sealed box with obsidian. It interferes with resonance. Avoid all mass broadcasts during announced tests. Do not watch them, even muted, even on delay. The signal rides piggyback on visual symbols as well. If you hear a sound that feels familiar, but makes your skin crawl, leave the area immediately. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't record it. The tone is self-replicating once acknowledged. Relearn. Silence. Turn off devices. Sit in dark analog spaces. The circle can't speak through silence unless you carry them inside. There is still time. Barely. The circle beneath has rewritten gods, memories, and lives across centuries, but it has one weakness. It depends on belief, on blind compliance, on the faith that we will not look twice, but you just did. You followed the spiral to its center. You heard the silence beneath the noise. Now the question is, will you forget again? Or will you remember before the tone comes? This was the final chapter of Bloodbound Madness, the cursed legacy of the Moorfields. If you felt it in your bones, don't share it. Bury it. Hide it. Prepare, because the tone is coming. And next time, it will not be fiction. End of series.